Sorry, no. Okay. Before we begin, just mind witnesses and those members to make sure the mobile phones are completely turned off, please. We're here today to continue our discussion on the future of the beef sector in the context of Foodwise 2025. I'd like to welcome the witnesses today from Tagus, Professor Frank O'Mara, Director of Research, and Mr. Pierce Kelly, Head of Dry Stock Knowledge Transfer Department. Thank you for coming before the committee today to discuss this issue, this very important issue with us today. Just the issue of privilege. Before we begin, I want to bring to your attention. Witnesses are protected by affidavit privilege in respect of the evidence you give to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the specific matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect of where possible. You should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name in such ways to make him or her identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that members should not comment on or criticise or make charges against either person outside the House or an official leader by name in such ways to make him or her identifiable. Professor O'Mara, I understand you are making the opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman, and good afternoon, Senators and Deputies. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address the committee on this very important topic. The first thing I'd like to do is just give the apologies of our Director, Professor Gerry Boyle, who has a meeting outside the country tomorrow and is at the airport as we speak. So, look, I'll go through this reasonably fast because there's a lot of information in there that people can have for reference or whatever afterwards, and leave us plenty of time for discussion. As the structure, the outline of the presentation, a minute or two on the structure of the beef industry, the challenges facing it. I suppose we'll focus a lot on the role of technical performance in terms of the profitability of the sector, a little bit on our research and advisory priorities and some of the initiatives that we have ongoing or recently started, and then finish by outlining the factors, I suppose, that are within our remit that impact on the net margin on beef farms. So just in terms of the structure of the industry, and I won't go too much into this, but basically I'm sure you're all familiar. We have an awful lot of beef farms in the country. This the CSO Farm Structures Survey, and in 2016 over half the farms in the country were designated as specialist beef production farms, and a good share of the other farms also had beef cattle on those farms. So it's the biggest sector of Irish agriculture in terms of the number of farms. If we look at those specialised beef producers and look at the farm size there, it's you can see the distribution from, on the left-hand side, farms less than 10 hectares, over on the right-hand side, farms greater than 100 hectares. And you can see that in general the distribution is towards the left. So the sector is characterised by relatively small farms, with the average farm size being 32.4 hectares. Nevertheless, the share of agricultural output that comes from the beef sector is very large, and it's the middle section on the graph there, and you can see that over the years it has maintained more or less around a third of the agricultural output of the overall sector. So it's a very important contributor to agricultural output from our farms. So it's a sector obviously facing many challenges, as you all well know, and these are some of the ones that come to mind. Brexit up there on the top of the list. Climate change very much on everybody's radar screens these days. EU trade deals are very important for the sector and the impact that could have on the market. We obviously are coming into the negotiation phase for the next phase of CAP, and the uncertainty around the outcome of that and potential changes to the distribution of direct income supports is again potentially a challenge for the sector, or for certain elements of the sector anyway. Obviously the price of cattle is a very important factor for the sector and profitability in it, and I suppose in particular fluctuations in beef cattle prices can cause big fluctuations in the income of farmers. And like all farmers, then beef farmers have to cope with things like severe weather events and the effect they have just on production systems and also then on input costs, and we saw that last year with relation to feed costs in particular. So despite all those challenges, it is a sector with a lot going for it, and one of the strong points of the sector is its environmental credentials, and Our beef is generally produced in situations of low intensity in comparison to many other beef production systems around the world, and these are generally very environmentally friendly. And we see our beef farmers very high participation rates in the agri-environmental schemes under Pillar 2. And when we look at the sustainability metrics, in other words, things like the carbon footprint or the water sustainability of our system, it compares very favourably to systems in other countries as an environmentally friendly system, and that's very important in today's world. Looking at I suppose how the sector is evolving in terms of numbers, there's obviously a lot of change happening in the Irish cattle herd at the moment, and this graph shows the change in the numbers of beef cows and dairy cows going back to 1980, and this was pre-quotas. We had 400,000 suckler cows, 1.4 million dairy cows. And when quotas came in, we had a gradual decline over the following 25 years or so in dairy cow numbers. They got down to just around 1 million in the late noughties and the end of that decade, whereas at the same time suckler cow numbers rose to over 1 million. And since the introduction or the abolition of milk quotas, and even before that, as farmers were preparing for it, dairy cow numbers have started to increase, and now they've gone back up towards 1.4 million. At the same time, over the last 6 or 7 years, suckler cow numbers have been trending downwards, not at a very rapid rate, but there is a couple of percent, I suppose, every year reduction in the suckler herd, and it's now down to slightly under 1 million cows. And I suppose the consequence, or one of the consequences of that, is that an increasing proportion of the beef output of Ireland will come from dairy beef, that is beef using calves born to dairy herds. And so the numbers of animals coming through the system might be relatively the same, but the proportion that come from the dairy side is increasing. And that has been a concern to many people, and with the worry that this will lead to a deterioration in the carcass quality. And I suppose it's not just the change in the proportions of dairy beef versus suckler beef that's at play here, but also the data show that the dairy beef carcasses themselves are also deteriorating in quality over time. There's a lot of figures on this graph, but if you just take the first block of figures, and this is your typical, I suppose, beef calf coming out of the dairy herd. It's an Aberdeen Angus sire and a Frisian dam. So if you look at the column highlighted there, in 2014, just about 12% of those fell into O minus or worse, and that proportion has risen to 21% in 2018. So we see this sort of decline in the quality of the dairy beef, as well as an increase in the amount of dairy beef. So there's two kind of things at play there. And it's the same if you look at Frisian sires by Frisian dams and so on up the line. The quality of those calves is deteriorating, albeit at a slow rate, but deteriorating. So this is a significant issue at industry level, and there have been a number of responses, and one of them is the Dairy Calf to Beef Index, which is an index developed by ourselves and ICBF to help farmers select dairy sires for dairy cows to breed beef cattle that will still be low in calving difficulty, short gestation, but will also have improved beef characteristics. So that index is available to dairy farmers for this current breeding season. And another way, I suppose, that the industry has responded is through ourselves and other players in the industry assisting us in terms of setting up a number of research and demonstration farm programs around the important parameters for dairy beef production, because it's not just about genetics, rare and good dairy beef, it's also about management. So there's a lot to be learned and to demonstrated to farmers about how to run a dairy calf to beef system well. Another significant issue in the industry is the export of live calves. and we have seen a significant increase in that in recent years. And so year to date, we're at over 140,000 calves exported, and if you go back to 2 years ago, that's a 55% increase on the numbers in 2017. And I suppose, you know, for the dairy industry, or for the beef industry, all those calves come from the dairy industry. This is a very important outlet for some of the lower genetic merit calves coming from the dairy sector, and the bulk of those calves that are exported are male progeny of dairy sires. So in other words, they're Friesian on Friesian, or Jersey on Jersey, or Friesian on Jersey, or whatever, you know. So they're a dairy sire anyway on a dairy cow. And here in Ireland, we don't have a veal industry, and that's where most of those calves on the continent would be going. So the outlet of exports is that alternative to having our own veal industry in this country. But you know, a really important issue for this industry, this dairy calf export industry, is the animal welfare standards. And you probably all are aware of a video that was doing the rounds a few weeks ago about calves being mistreated in France, and obviously that type of thing is abhorrent to us, and it just is not acceptable in the industry. And for the industry to continue to exist, it's going to have to eliminate any kind of an incident like that. So that's some background, and the last thing I want to look at just is the money, and this is family farm income, which is includes the direct payments that farmers receive. And just to explain the graph for a second, you know, the first block of bars there are the dairy industry going back from 2011 up to 2017. This is income from the National Farm Survey. The second batch are cattle rearing farms, which tend to be your suckler farms. Cattle other are a mixture of you know, store, finishers, so on, calf to beef, and so on, sheep and tillage across the line. And I suppose this graph really sets out the difficulty facing the industry, which is the low income that it generates for beef farmers. So, you know, income there hovering around €10,000 per farm, in comparison to dairy, and, you know, varying anywhere from 50 up to above 80,000. So that is, you know, of all the challenges facing the sector, I think that consistently has been the greatest one. Family farm income, just to be clear what that is, it's what's left over after costs are paid to remunerate family labour and to give a return on owned land and capital. And I suppose, you know, it's important when you see those figures to reflect on, or to understand that with the beef sector we are dealing with a very diverse sector. It's by far, you know, the most diverse of all those systems there, you know, dairy, sheep or tillage. And we have a huge diversity of the type of system that farmers operate. We have quite a large number of part-time farmers in it, some full-time, but a lot of part-time farmers as well. A huge diversity in terms of the skills and the age profile of farmers, and also probably in the motivation, as in, you know, you might say, well, what comes under other? Well, you know, quite a few people live inherited land and they don't want to part with that out of the family. They have another job or whatever, and just for them it's important to maintain the land and keep farming it. So profit mightn't be the ultimate motivation for some of the participants in the beef sector. Not saying everybody obviously wants to make as much as they can, but it's maybe that there are other factors that come into play as well. So that's, I suppose, the kind of stark picture as regards profitability and income. I suppose where do we come into this as an organisation? And I suppose our view on it is that there are opportunities for committed beef producers, and you know, they may be a relatively small proportion, but there are farmers who are making a net profit per hectare. Net profit excludes your direct payments, so, you know, there are farmers who make the business or who run their businesses profitably. And there is potential for a lot of other beef farmers to improve profitability and thereby increase your profitability. And I suppose one of the features of the profitable farms is that they are constantly adaptive and responsive to new technologies and to the findings of research and to the messages coming out through advisory programmes. So these are just breaking down those income figures that some of the income figures we saw earlier. These are net margin now, so they don't include the direct payments. So we can see that the top 20% of farmers do consistently achieve a positive net margin. These are specialist cattle rearing farms. It's not a big net margin, but it is positive. And I suppose the next couple of rows down, there is potential for those farms, we feel, through efficiency and technology to improve their net margin as well. So this, I suppose, is what keeps us committed to the sector, which is that improving the technical performance and the stocking rate will improve profitability on farms. And just want to show you a few slides to illustrate this point. And this is a slide just taking the performance of a typical suckler cow, the suckler cow that you would find on the national average farm, and then comparing that to the high performance farms, in other words, maybe that top 15 or 20% of farms, and just looking at the difference in some of the parameters that are within the control, I suppose, of the farmer. So the number of calves weaned per cow per year, on average 85 per 100 or 0.85, best performers achieving 0.95, and that's worth an extra €87 per cow. Age at first calving, on average 32 months. The better farmers would be calving down heifers at 24 months. Again, there's a saving of €50 per cow. 6-week calving rate, 55% on average. If you can bring that to 80%, the saving of €28. And so on. The average daily gain of calves, €86 of a difference between the average and the better, and concentrates fed to the cow-calf unit, again another €52. So the better farms, if you are able to move yourself from the average up to that better cohort, there's an extra €300 of margin to be made there per cow. And that's, you might say, well, that's all very well, that's very theoretical. Are farmers actually doing that? So the next two charts I want to show outline, or illustrate this actually happening in practice. So this is one of the programmes you may have heard of. It's the Teagasc Irish Farmers Journal Better Beef programme. This is a programme where we work with something of the order of, depending on the time, 25 to 35 beef farmers. They usually are in the programme for 3 to 4 years. We work intensively with them on a programme of improving their technical performance, their financial management as well, and so on. And we follow through then the impact of the changes they make in terms of their output, but more importantly their profitability. So this graph here shows the cohort of farmers we took into the phase 2 of it. So they started in 2012, and their average gross margin now per hectare was about €550. And you can see that their output per hectare was 600 kilos of beef per hectare. And over the course of the programme, they increased that output through increased stocking rate, better performance, up to over 800 kilos per hectare. But you see the gross margin on those farms had increased to over €1,000 per hectare. And that's not through getting bigger or anything. That was simply through applying best technology on those farms. They're real farms. They're not our farms. They're farmers' farms. We just worked with them. They were mainly suckler beef farmers. We have another programme called the Green Acres programme that concentrates on dairy calf to beef, and again it's the same principle. These are farmers' farms, and we give them an intensive advisory support. And you can see that, again I won't go down through all the details, but the gross margin on those farms at the start of the programme was €513, and the gross margin at the end of it 3 years later was over €1,000, and the net margin, you can see, again improved by about €500 per hectare. Now, there may have been price movements in between those years. This isn't corrected for changes in beef prices, and there would have been some element of that, but the vast majority of both those improvements were better technical performance. So look, our goal then is, or we see that as where we can contribute positively to the beef sector by helping farmers improve their productivity and try to make a few steps along that ladder of improving their margins. So the areas we concentrate on, there's nothing secret or magic about them. Genetic merit of the animals, reproductive efficiencies, grassland management is hugely important, animal health, financial performance and environmental sustainability. And I'm not going to go through these slides, but these are just some of the initiatives that we have ongoing or have started recently in relation to the beef sector, and they're in the slides we distributed. If people want to ask us anything about them, we're very happy to discuss them. But just to illustrate that there is a lot of research and advisory activities ongoing in support of the beef sector. So just finish with this slide, which is, for us, this is where it's at. How can farmers do things inside their own farm gates to maximise their net margin? And it is maximised where there's a focus on optimising performance per livestock unit farmed through the key technologies of grassland management, genetics, reproductive performance and animal health. You can't ignore the importance of stocking rate. If you grow more grass, you have to carry more animals to get the value of that grass. So operating at a high stocking rate, whatever is appropriate for land type and labour availability and infrastructure and so on, but you carry the animals that suits your farm. Your overhead costs must match the level of output. Direct payments obviously have to be maximised. The investments in infrastructure should allow for efficient use of time and labour on farms, in particular, for part-time farms, but also for full-time farms. And net margin is obviously related to the inclusion or incorporation of the latest innovations coming from research and advice into farm operations. So that's, I think, for us, that's the contribution we can make to this sector, is trying to make sure that farmers can maximise their return based on how efficiently they run their enterprises. So thank you, and happy to deal with any questions or clarifications.
Thanks very much, Professor O'Mara. Now I'll take questions from the members. Deputy Kenny, Senator Conway-Walsh, Deputy Cahill, Deputy Daly and Senator Lombard in that order. Please.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you for your presentation. It's quite informative. A couple of questions in regard to the suckler sector, and I come from a part of the country where it's nearly all small suckler farmers with an average of 10 to 15 cows. And I suppose that the key thing is that the cow has to be kept all year round, and the only thing that produces the calf. That's one of the problems. But I'm interested in the Better Beef Challenge as to what type of land, or where is that being run? What is it? Is it primarily in the west? Is it primarily in the Midlands? Or is it to get these calves up to a stage where they're, I suppose, beyond Wainlands and sold on to finishers, or is it actually to finish them off? Also, in regard to the other sector where you talk about the best practice on dairy to beef, because some farmers around us now are starting this thing where they're taking in the dairy calves and rearing them, usually on contract. And as I say, the biggest cost the dairy farmer or the suckler farmer has is trying to keep this cow all year round. And if you have 15 cows and only 2 of them don't go in calf, you have a big cost keeping that in place. And the type of structure you have there, and how is it possible in the future to see a situation where there is an alternative model developed? Because the model we have at the moment is that the suckler cow is kept on the more marginal, I suppose, more difficult type land that may be suitable for dairying or for tillage or for other things, and kept there, produced the calf, a very, very good quality weanling calf is produced and sold on then to be finished somewhere else. Is there an alternative model for that can work on that type of land and produce a higher income per hectare, and that will actually work, that's feasible? It's not something that's going to be a trial, or what trials have been done in that already to prove the concept of that. The big issue here, of course, is the price, and what price they can get returned. And the prices that's been returned from the factories at the moment is not meeting either for the for any sector of it. It's just not able to provide the level of income, and for that level of income to be fed back down the line to the suckler farmer, from the beef producer, for to make either sector of it viable, either the finisher or the suckler. And the only, or one of the suggestions that has been made is that there needs to be more emphasis placed on providing producer groups where they can get a better price from their come together groups of farmers and produce the finished animal and sell it at a higher price, because and we had various groups in here talking about that as to what way they were going to do that. Now there's question marks around that, but however, that concept, I'm wondering, how much work has been done on that, and are we near, or could we come to a situation where you could see on poorer land in the west of Ireland where you could see farmers being able to finish their cattle, or is there any model that could be developed around that, where they could actually finish them on that type of land and take perhaps quality beef cattle, quality beef calves from the dairy herd and finish them and make a better profit on them than they have at the moment, where they're having to keep a suckler cow to produce that calf? I'll leave it at that, Chairman.
Thanks, Deputy. Senator Conway-Walsh.
Thank you, Cahill. I just want to ask you again around the impact, how you see things going in terms of the dairy industry growing, and the impact that that's going to have on beef, because beef farmers, I suppose, are particularly concerned about where it's all going to end. I do want to commend you on some of the measures in the knowledge transfer scheme and all of those things, and I think they're hugely important. But at the end of the day, unless we get to sort out where the actually 2.4 billion connected to the beef industry is going, we won't be able to sort the problem. So we'll be limited in how we approach this problem. I want to ask you as well, have you done any models of the vertical integration as is being done with pigs and poultry and other sectors? And why cannot that be done with beef? And I want you to comment on, I suppose, the beef industry, or farming in particular, particularly farming on the marginalised land where I come from, in terms of looking at farming in the west of Ireland in terms of a public good, and what supports you think need to be put in place to really look at farming in the more marginalised areas as a public good, in terms of the contribution that it makes to rural Ireland and to rural communities. I'll probably leave my question in at that. I mean, I want to ask what your relationship is with the beef factories, and what role that you can play in terms of the pricing with beef factories, and again maybe what you're doing in terms of export and in terms of trying to engage with the Chinese market and the replacement of the shortage of pork in that area. I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Senator, Deputy Cahill.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to thank the representatives of Tigers there for, I think, which was a most informative presentation. I suppose I'd just like to ask a few different questions there. And the first one, you had an indication there about the increased proportion, you had a graph there about the increased proportion of beef that will come from the dairy herd. And I'd just like to know, in 4 or 5 years' time, have you figures, have you projected where you think the dairy herd size will go? Have you predicted where the suckler herd will be as regards numbers? And what potential for, like, we have the increase in live exports there you had the figure there on the graph there as well, how much has gone up. But have you the figure where you'd expect, what potential is there on that for the next 4 to 5 years of further expansion? And the graph, while it says an increased proportion, I'd just like to see if we could get more meat on the statistics that was in that one. I suppose the second one I want to make, and I think it's a bit of a criticism, and you talked on the EBI index, and the reality is, for the last number of years on the beef side, on the index, there's been absolutely no value put, or very little value put on the beef side. And whether it's on the carcass value of the cow at culling or the value of the calf at sale. In the calculation of the EBI index, I think this is something where definitely there has to be a policy adjustment, because at the end of the day, the EBI index should reflect the profitability of the farm. And like, if you take a 20% replacement rate for cows, that's 1 in 5 years. A cow would be replaced, and like the value under the carcass between a Frisian cow, a good type Frisian cow, and a Jersey cross cow, I think that hasn't been in the EBI index, and I think it's something that needs to be rectified. And I think it has given, the minus side of the cross breeding on the beef genetics hasn't been economically evaluated to the extent that I definitely would like, and I think to an extent that would influence farmers' decisions as regards their breeding. The third point there, just on live exports, and just my understanding on live exports, and just correct me if I'm wrong, is that Jersey crosses aren't welcome, whether they're either from a Jersey cow or from a Jersey dam. That live exports, that the veal units on the continent don't want these animals, and that a number of them did get there in the past, and the performance was put a threat on our whole business relationships with the veal units. So I would just like, has there been any evaluation of those calves? Have they any potential for the veal units, or are they an absolute no-go area? I think the income figures that you gave there, the net profit per hectare, and the rise that there was over the last number of years where people were involved in various discussion groups, I think that was the real eye-opener to me on your presentation. And I just like, the figures you gave there on farmers that's involved in knowledge transfer groups, and that, is there a breakdown of those, whether they're full-time farmers, on their acreage size? Is there, you had a lot of figures there earlier on about the size of farmers that's involved in beef production, and I'd like to know, does that is there a correlation with the knowledge transfer, or is it the larger beef farmers are getting involved in the knowledge transfer programme? Because it was clear, with the figures you were showing there, that that the knowledge transfer had a huge input into the income per hectare. At the end of the day, I think that is absolutely key. But if you take the amount of dairy farmers that's involved in discussion groups and the percentage of beef farmers that's involved in the same, it's very minute. And while we have had the beef genomics programme, which has acted as an incentive, I would just like to get your views. Is there, there was a lot of resistance to that in the past, but has, the views of dairy farmers improved as regards participation in that? And is there any way that we can get, is there any way that you would suggest that we can get a substantial increase in the number of farmers that's partaken in your scheme? I suppose, the membership of beef farmers in Teagasc, what is the membership there? And I suppose maybe an unfair question to you, Frank, but do you feel that farmers, beef farmers especially, are only have a link with Teagasc in order for the filling of forms and to make sure that they're involved in GLAS and various schemes, or are you seeing any increase in the participation in these knowledge transfer groups? Because the figures you put up there are absolutely the difference and the improvement there was over a short period of time, and the profitability was startling. And we'll be arguing here about 5 or 10 cents a kilo in beef price, but the increased efficiency there with the graphs you were showing, I think was very, very significant. So there's some questions, and I suppose we were in Moore Park a couple of months ago, this committee, and I raised questions that day about the focus on our dairy farms, on our dairy research farms, on crossbreeding. And I suppose I'd just like to know, has there been any realignment of that focus, or do they see that crossbreeding is still a key part of the dairy research going forward, and the implications of it on our beef output? Has the evaluation of that increased?
Next Deputy Senator Daly, please. Next.
Thanks, Chair, and I'd like to thank Frank and Pearse for their presentation and being here today. I suppose just to comment on the overall scene, and I welcome the presentation and I welcome the good work that Teagasc are doing, but we're all familiar with this 21, 28, 51 when it comes to beef that's going around, that of every euro that's spent in across the counter by the person buying Irish beef, that 21 cents of that, or 21%, is the farmer's cut, and 28 is the processors, and 51 is the retailers. So while you have no influence on, and probably you're not even in a position to comment on how we'd improve that percentage take for the farmer, your good work here is trying to enhance and increase and improve the farmer's profitability within a very small percentage of the overall take for beef. So how, the most efficient farmer you have out there, you're still talking about increasing his percentage profitability of a very small percent of the overall income that's coming into the beef sector, the vast majority of which is going into the processors and the retailers. And I know nobody can, and you're on a par with the rest of us here, address how we increase the farmer's take on that, but that is basically the bottom line issue here. Just to tease out some of your processes and your production improvements for farmers, and incorporating into that what has been mentioned already, the increase in the dairy calf, and the increase in the proportion of beef that we're either going to be eating ourselves here or hopefully exporting, is going to come from the dairy herd. To rear a dairy calf as a substitute for a farmer who has been rearing sucklers, and I suppose the internal conflict to an extent here when we talk about beef is, some of us like myself, and I suppose Deputy Kenny, the farther west you go on that, beef is suckler, in our heads. And if you look at any of the promotional work on Irish beef, it's a picture of a lovely Charolais cow with a fine big calf on a lovely flush green grass field, and we're portraying and sending out that image of grass-fed, origin green, etc., etc., etc. The farther we move, and no matter how efficiently we do it, to rearing beef calves to beef, there are going to be a hell of a lot more inputs, a hell of a lot more time spent on concretes, floors, slots, whatever, and inside. While we might be getting it right in one way, are we running the risk of damaging our image in the long run? And no matter how efficient we become at producing the dairy-bred calf, could we, in the process of doing that, lose our grass-fed image, which could be detrimental at the end of the day to the selling of the beef? And all your figures, all your tables include the direct payment, and obviously enough it's there, but we can see from the figures you give us how integral and how important an element of farmers' income that direct payment is. So where would you see, and again it won't be Teagasc's call, I suppose it won't even be ours, it'll be farther up the chain than us that will make the final decisions, but where would you like, built into your systems, to see the emphasis on the next cap payments? Like, will loss payments hopefully still continue? Will there still be knowledge transfer? They would be the two, other than the direct payment, I suppose, which suckler farmers in particular can benefit from as an aside to their beef rearing. Or what would you have an opinion on where you would like to see the most beneficial payment coming to the beef sector, and how it would be most beneficial and how it would improve not just the farmer's lot but the production processes that they're operating in? I suppose it's more to the beef sector and the processor side of things, but how do you see the larger kill to produce the same amount of beef because of the nature of the beast that we're going to be rearing going forward from the dairy herd? What kind of an image will that portray? Can you see any advantages in it, or is it, when you're doing your sums, I suppose is what I'm asking now, of the overall bottom line for a farmer at the end of the year. If he moves from suckler to rearing the dairy calf to produce the same amount of beef, he's going to have to rear a lot more calves than his cows were rearing. So when you balance the two, will he actually be better off at the end of the day? Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Senator Lombard.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'd like to apologise for missing some of the presentation, and of course acknowledge Tagish's great role in trying to ensure we do have profitability when it comes to beef farming itself. Could I ask about two things itself? That's probably the industry has seen major movements regarding suckler cows and trends regarding suckler cows, moving away from suckler cows. And particularly my part of the world has been mentioned by other people, the phenomenon of contract rearing for calves, for dairy calves, for dairy herds has become the more profitable issue within the actual beef industry. Farmers are getting probably paid every month. They're getting a set for. You have no issue with the actual, with the marks or with the actual factories itself. It's becoming a pathway that an awful lot, in particular, young farmers are looking towards. They're not all about going into dairy, maybe, but they might see the opportunity going into the actual platform of contract rearing. Where do you think that lies in the future of agriculture itself, in the future of the actual beef industry, in the future of the industry itself? Do you think you're going to have more of a movement to that actual issue itself, and issues regarding B&Bs and issues regarding that kind of legislation? Do we need to be looking at that to streamline to make it more easier? Could I ask also about the actual ability for us as an entity to work together as farming groups, working together to get a better price on the actual factory floor itself? Such like producer groups. Has there been much activity on that actual floor itself? And what role does Tagish have regarding promoting and activating the actual producer group model? So you do have a conglomeration of multiples of farmers working together to get a better floor price when it comes to having probably a more of an actual power hand with dealing with the actual entities itself. And where do you see that lies in the actual future of getting a better price for your product itself? So there are probably two key issues. But the way the industry is folding and moving at the moment, you're seeing large numbers of suckler cows moving off. Obviously, the knock-on effect is you're not going to have the weanlings that would be at foot. Would you have a fear that maybe in a decade, and I put this question to the meat industry and they probably fluff the answer, would you have a fear for the meat industry in a decade's time that it might be made up of Frisian cull cows and Angus bulls and heifers? Would you have a fear for the industry going forward if that was to be the actual marketability element of the actual industry? And where would you see the actual industry on that kind of footing? Thank you.
Senator. Next is Senator Mulherin.
Two questions, really. First of all, I'd like to again welcome the 100 million rescue package for beef farmers. It's very important that we have this money available to make an intervention in relation to the beef sector to support it, and we're discussing the value of it here. There's lots of suggestions as to how it might be spent, but I'd like to ask you, how might it be best targeted? Just your ideas in relation to that for the best outcomes for the beef sector, and particularly I suppose the farmer, obviously the primary producer, which will be targeted at, but so is that they're some sort of cushion. They have some sort of cushion, and that they're not put off entirely. That they don't pull out of suckler farming or beef farming. And one other question as well that is just escaping me. Maybe I might think of it. It was one other question.
You can come back in anyway.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Deputy Murphy, have you a question? Are you okay for the moment?
I was missing for the presentation, and I'm not on the committee, but I do appreciate that you.
Come back in later on.
I just want to probably, like Senator Mulherin, the 100 million, the commitment of the 50 million from the government and the EU is really to be welcomed. And the question I suppose I have is, how quick is this going to be implemented? Because time is of the essence here. And I hope that next autumn we're still not, asking questions of how it's going to be implemented. And I'll leave it for that for now. And thank you.
Just a question.
Yeah, okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, just in relation to the whole issue of, we've obviously had success, the Minister has success, and Board B has had success in finding new markets for our meat and also increasing live exports. But notwithstanding this, and even I noted coverage at one stage in relation to the Chinese market was concerned that the meat processors wouldn't have enough meat to send out to them. But notwithstanding this demand, it doesn't seem to help the farmer, the primary producer, and I guess it's something that was raised there by Senator Lombard as well. Like, how do we protect them from the volatility in the price they receive and the very vulnerable position they're in? I know that there's EU endeavours, wide endeavours to protect the primary producer and recognising their position in their weak bargaining position in the food supply chain. But, you know, it seems to me no matter what good work is done by the Minister and all the agencies of government to find new markets and sell, that the farmer is still in the same predicament, that they're not getting money for the animal they're producing. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator. Before I come back to you, gentlemen, just I suppose 2 questions, or maybe 1 question in one. I suppose in your presentation you mentioned, I suppose, the key challenges going forward, be it cap reform and climate change. And I think climate change is probably the biggest issue as we go forward. From your point of view in Teagasc, what work/research have you been doing at the moment in the last period of time to educate, I suppose, the farmers of today about the requirements that will be of tomorrow? Because there's no doubt, whether we like it or not, we're into a totally different sphere from a climate change perspective, and we've got to have to be ready for that, I would say, as we go forward. And what work have you been doing over the last period of time to make sure that we're going to be ahead of the pack when it comes to that? So in your own time, Professor Amaro.
Okay, thank you, and I'll Pierce will answer a share of these as well. So look, there's a lot of questions around price and the market, I suppose, and look, you know, we'll maybe comment on it as we're going through, but we don't have any answers really on that. You know what I mean? It's a huge conundrum. Obviously, the big issues for a beef farmer is the price he gets for cattle and how efficiently and at what cost he can produce those cattle. And I suppose our role is really with the second part of that: how efficiently and at what cost can he produce those cattle. Getting an adequate return from the market is the second half of the job then for the beef farmer, and that's one where we have no influence. Obviously, for our clients, we'd love to see them getting more back from the market, but it's anyway. We'll comment on some of the individual questions as we're going through them. Deputy Kenny, you asked about the Better Beef Farm and where were programme and where were those farmers. Well, they are literally all around the country. In every county we had Better Beef Farms and on all land types. And you know, there was variation in the performance or the profitability due to land type, but on all land types we were able to show an improvement in performance from focusing in on the technical efficiencies. Piers, you might want to come in on that in a minute. And then you asked in relation to an alternative model for the suckler cow, and I suppose I think you mentioned another deputy mentioned contract rearing. I suppose, look, there are alternative models. Dairy calf to beef is an alternative model, but we see the suckler model as being integral really for the future on a lot of the farms where you mentioned, for various reasons. Suckler cows will not be, you know, not everybody is going to go into dairy calf to beef. It doesn't suit everybody. It's very labour intensive at the rearing phase and so on. So sucklers are a very suitable type of a system for a lot of the small fragmented farms with maybe wetland and so on that you're talking about. So look, it's not a very profitable enterprise. That's what the figures show, but we have to keep working at it, and the marketplace has to keep working and trying to return a viable return to farmers involved in that system. And as we said, like we see there's an opportunity there by better things like better grassland management and better fertility to make the job a bit better on those farms. Price, obviously, a huge issue, and not denying that. And producer groups, you know, over the years there's been lots of talk about producer groups and trying to get farmers together and maybe try to brand our beef better. And look, I think they can play a role. They haven't to date. They've been hugely significant for the sector. either in sheep, either, there are a number of producer groups that are working very well, but they tend to be localised in terms of the overall national picture. They don't comprise a large part of the sheep kill, and it'll be the same, or is the same on the beef, really. So look, it's something I think has to be worked on, but it'll probably be slow progress in terms of getting producer groups established and making a significant impact really on the industry. Senator Conway-Walsh asked about the impact of the dairy sector on the beef sector, and look, there's no doubt we're seeing a fundamental change really in the beef sector, which is maybe going back to where we were a little bit in the past, when we had 400,000 suckler cows and 1.4 million dairy cows. And I don't know, I'm not suggesting we're going to get back to that sort of a level of suckler cows, at least not in the short or medium term. But I think there were lots of differences then as well. Like at the time we had 70,000 dairy farmers. The average size of the average dairy herd at that time was 20 cows. Now those farmers, a lot of them have got out of dairy and got into sucklers or whatever, and they're not going to go back into dairy production. So while there is a fundamental change going on, it's not back to the future, because the structure of the industry has changed quite significantly. It is going to impact on the share of the kill that's coming from dairy beef. We see the trend in that in the last couple of years. That's just going to continue. I think that's why it's really important then that we work on the quality of the calf coming from the dairy herd, as well as continuing to support the suckler herd. In terms of models of vertical integration, there is a certain amount of that going on through factories contracting to feedlots, really to finish cattle, contracting farmers with feedlots to finish cattle. We've seen a few models over the last number of years. There were some models where factories integrated with suppliers for particular markets, and there's been some new developments in that region as well. And look, I think they are, they have a role to play in terms of trying to give some certainty to the producer as to what the margin might be at the end of it. And Senator Conway-Walsh also talked about the role of farming as a public good, and one of the slides we showed there was its environmental performance, and beef farming has a very, very strong environmental performance, and it contributes a lot to biodiversity, it contributes a lot to good water quality and so on, and that is a very important facet of the industry. And there was a question in relation to the cap from Senator Daly, and I think the cap should and will, I think, try to target the people that are supplying those environmental goods in a way that rewards them for that contribution that they're making. Senator Conway-Walsh also asked about our relationship with beef factories and our role with regard to pricing and role in relation to exports to China. Well, look, we have no kind of formal relationship with the beef factories. We collaborate with them in various initiatives that they take, I suppose, to try to support producers. Very often we collaborate with them on that. So, for instance, the Better Beef programme that I talked about, the Teagasc Farmers Journal Better Beef programme, the people that put the money in to hire the advisors that work on that are the three large meat companies, isn't it?
Three and FPD.
Yeah, and FPD. So things like that. We also collaborate with them on research around meat quality through Meat Technology Ireland, which is an Enterprise Ireland funded initiative, Enterprise Ireland and Meat Factories funded initiative looking at the post-farm gate aspects of meat quality. So we collaborate with them on that, but as regards we have no relationship at all with them with regard to pricing or how they fix prices or fix. I don't mean that in the term it might be interpreted, but just in we'll say how they set prices. Yeah. And in relation to exports to China, again, we don't have a very significant or direct role in that, but we have been involved in I suppose, you know, when the various delegations come here to Ireland, we support the department in relation to bringing them out onto farms and telling them about the production system and giving them the information really as to, you know, the sustainability and the animal welfare aspects of our industry. So that's the kind of support role that we would play in relation to helping.
Would you say that the present model of suckler farming is a model that can work into the future profitably? Has it got a future? That's really the nub of it here. There's many of us beginning to doubt whether it has a future.
Yeah, no, look, absolutely, we think it has, because, you know, we see farmers can make money out of it, and the kind of, you know, programmes that we showed there illustrate that. It's always going to be lower. Well, who knows, you should never say always, but, you know, it always has been lower margin than dairying, and that's the attraction for beef farmers to exit out of beef into dairy, and is a higher margin per hectare. But for various reasons that I talked about at the start, whether it's fragmentation, whether it's the fact that farm size doesn't allow a large-scale dairy enterprise, or whether it's the fact that people are working part-time, there are a lot of farmers for whom beef production, and indeed that suckler production, is the most suitable system. And we think that by the application of the technologies we talked about, yes, it can be operated profitably, albeit at a lower level than you're going to find with dairying. So we're not giving up on it, basically. Deputy Cahill asked in relation to the proportion of beef from the dairy herd and where might it be in 4 to 5 years' time. Look, you know, I suppose we don't have a crystal ball. We did an exercise recently where we tried to model that for the future, how the dairy and the beef sector might co-evolve. And basically what we did was we took a number of scenarios, I suppose, you know, which range from rapid expansion of dairy and rapid fall of suckler cows. I think kind of neither are the most likely. We're probably seeing a 1 to 2% expansion in dairy cow numbers over the next couple of years, based on what we see with heifers on the ground and inseminations and so on for our calves born this year. So the kind of 4 to 5% expansion phase is probably, at least we're in a slower expansion at the moment on the dairy side, and the suckler side over the last 3 to 4 years has been probably what appears 2 to 3% a year. So whether that picks up in terms of more conversions just remains to be seen. But you know, that's the trend. It's a question of how, I suppose, do those trends remain at that sort of modest level, or do they accelerate in either direction? To me, it looks like a more kind of a modest trends that we're going to see for the next couple of years. You talked about the EBI index, and you talked about your visit to Moore Park and so on. Look, I'm not an expert on breeding, and maybe Pierce will want to pick up on this one in a minute. Just to say, in relation to our own breeding policy, one of the most important herds that we have below in Moore Park, and I wasn't there the day that you visited, but you probably saw the next generation herd, which is kind of the herd we're saying we're trying to look forward to see, well, what might the average cow be like, the average cow that will be there in 10 years' time. What does that cow look like now? I don't mean appearance-wise, but just how does she perform? And that herd, which is kind of one of the flagship herds we have, is not a crossbred herd. That's a Holstein herd. So we're not all Jerseys by any manner of means, and we don't see, you know, that the future is crossbred for everybody. Like, they are a relatively small proportion of the dairy herd is crossbreds. It's something, I don't know, 5% or thereabouts. It's relatively small. We have, in relation to our own farms this year, and we put out this information. We didn't use any, or the only Jersey semen that we used on our own cows this year was sexed Jersey semen, with a view to avoiding any male Jersey calves or crossbred Jersey calves coming out. So we published that approach of ours. We put it out in the media, and my understanding is that quite a few farmers also followed that practice this spring. The jerseys and live exports, I don't know, Pierce, maybe you might pick up on that in a minute, whether there's an appetite for jerseys or a lack of appetite by live exporters. My understanding is that at this stage of the year, there's quite a few of them being exported because there's a lot of demand for those calves now. But maybe Pierce, you might know a little bit more about that, but I'll leave that to you in a minute. You asked then in relation to the Better Farm programme, which was one of our knowledge transfer programmes, and the data that we put up there, and the dairy calf beef one. And whether it was larger beef farmers or not. Well, just to clarify, the data that I showed for the Better Beef programme and the dairy calf to beef programme, they were selected farmers, for want of a better word. Like that was, we'll say, 25 or 30 farmers in the Better Beef programme and 10 farmers in the Green Acres dairy calf to beef. But they were a range of sizes, I suppose, medium to large, rather than small. But the wider question then is of whether our clients are large or small. Well, we've a mixture of clients, and was it Senator Daly asked? Definitely Cap were the only with us for the schemes. Again, Pierce, you might pick up on that, the number that we have in discussion groups. So Senator Daly, you rightly pointed out that we're working on a very small part of the cake. About 20% of the kind of retail value is what ends up with the farmer, and that's what the part that we're trying to improve the profitability. Yes, that is a fact, I suppose, but look, it's always, a mantra from anybody, any business person is really control what you can control yourself and do that well. And I suppose, look, that's what we work with farmers, to try to help them do what they can control as best as they can. The wider picture and the share of the cake is, I guess, a bigger issue that you may come to later. In relation to what we'd like to see in the next CAP, look, we don't have a particular view on that. We provide information and advice to government on any scenarios they want us to model, but I think everyone would think that important issues like you mentioned, Chairman, of climate change and other environmental issues, that the CAP will probably reflect those issues in the next iteration of it to a greater or lesser extent. And so Senator Lombard then again talked about the trend away from sucklers and highlighted the increase in contract calf rearing, dairy calves being contract reared on beef farms, and yes, that has developed as a successful enterprise on a significant number of farms at this stage, and we see that trend continuing. I don't know what level it will get to. There's probably maybe appears around 1,000 of those farms we might estimate that are doing contract rearing at this stage, and will it double? I don't know, but there's certainly a trend for an increase in that. And I think the farmers, it's not for everybody. Not every farmer would want to do it, but the ones that are doing it like the certainty with regard to income. And for the dairy farmers, it's a real important, I suppose, outlet or way to reduce workload on some dairy farms. I'm not aware, and Senator Lombard asked, were there issues that need to be streamlined. We're not aware that there are any particular barriers to that, or legislative issues or regulatory issues that are holding that back. And again, Senator Lombard mentioned about producer groups, and we've just touched on that already. And Senator Lombard asked, were we afraid that there wouldn't be enough quality cattle around in 10 years' time? Well, look, I don't see that we're not going to have a significant suckler herd still in 10 years' time. We'll have more dairy calf to beef, I think, to some extent, and it'll be a challenge for the beef industry to ensure that they can market all the types of animals really that are coming out of the beef industry. So Senator Mulherin asked about the 100 million and any suggestions we'd have to target it. And look, that's there's lots of people have lots of suggestions. There's lots of farmers that had a tough 6 or 8 months in relation to beef prices. So there's lots of ways that will be suggested to cut that cake, and I leave it to the Minister and his officials in their wisdom to spend that wisely and try to ensure that it goes to the people that had suffered the biggest losses over the last period. And Deputy Deering, you asked yourself, Chairman, about our work on climate change and what we're doing to I suppose, inform and educate farmers in relation to it. And look, we're I suppose, every kind of major event we have, we highlight the important issues with regard to the environment. So our last open day in Grange, we would have had a big element on the environment. Our programmes with Better Farm programmes and so on, we again try to highlight the environmental issues as much as we can, and in our ag colleges, our students are well trained in this. Sometimes it can be hard to get farmers engaged around this. They're much more interested in talking about breeding quality or grassland management, but I think as the public debate about it increases, farmers are becoming more and more informed and wish to know about it and to be able to put their side of the story out as well. And I think the farm organisations represent them quite well in that regard. Pierce, do you want to pick up on?
Before I go to Pierce, just 2 members have brief questions to follow up. You might have before you come in. Deputy Murphy first of all. Sorry, Deputy Cahill first, and then Deputy Murphy.
So just on the 6 semen there, have you percentages on the fertility and also on the cost?
Yeah. So,
sorry, Deputy Murphy,
yes,
do together.
I just, I suppose the initial question I asked about the aid for the beef industry, I accept probably, you can't answer that. But you see, I'm quite concerned here. If you look at the statistics, if you look over the past 5 years, I think it's in excess of 2,000 families have left the land, and that's constantly declining. And the one thing going to IFA meetings and the beef forum meetings in recent time, particularly in my side of the country where suckler and suckler on to beef, has already been mentioned, is so big, so many people are now threatening either to sell their land or turn it into forestry. Now, like everybody else, there is a place for forestry, I accept that, but we don't need this blanket forestry all over the place. And quite, good land is going to be used up for forestry. We all accept this land there that's acceptable only for forestry, that's fine. So, really, aren't we facing a very, very difficult crisis? I mean, 70,000 people, are directly involved in employment from the farming sector. 17,000. I'm not taking into to production of food or anything. I'm just talking about the family farms, etc., contracts and on. That's a lot of people. And that sector is under pressure at the moment. So what I'm saying is, would you think that there is a need for extra financial support for that farming sector, particularly that suckler beef, and I know our own party has been proposing this, on an ongoing basis? Because, while we all welcome the 50 million plus the 50 million from the government, it's good. It's only a stopgap measure in my view. And would you accept, as the advisors to the farming community, and in many respects lots of good advice given down through the years, would you accept there's going to be a need for extra financial support for that sector if it is to survive? And if not, if you look down the road 10 years, where will it be? Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Deputy Murphy. Mr. Kelly or Professor O'Mara, whichever you want to take it up now, I don't mind.
Do you want to go back over one and then come back to
I can come back to those, Deputy. Yeah, just in relation to the Better Beef programme, Deputy Kenny was asking, Frank already covered that. I suppose what we see with the Better Beef programme is that there's a range of beef systems in that. And it goes back to some of the things that some of the other deputies were asking there as well, especially Deputy Senator Daly, in relation to which systems are the most profitable in that. Probably the system that's under the most pressure, and this is probably the most common in the western part of the country, is where suckler farmers who are rearing weanlings up to calves on those cows up to 7-8 months of age, and then selling those calves to finishers in either neighbouring finishers or in other parts of the country. There's a big cost on keeping that suckler cow, and the value of that calf, or the lack of value in that calf, can often have a big impact on profitability. Now, what we've seen with the likes of the Better Beef programme over the last number of years, and also Profit Monitor results, is that those farmers who have the ability to take those animals on that bit longer, on to perhaps finish them, they are more profitable on that. So it's just to make the point that, you know, a high proportion of suckler farmers are in a system that where they're selling the calves at a young age, and that can be down to land type, labour availability, housing availability on the farm, and that. And what we've encouraged people in those programmes, especially where Frank showed the graph there, where there was a big increase in profitability, quite a lot of that was a change in system on their farm to keeping more integrated system all the way through to beef. In relation to the Deputy Cahill's question in terms of live exports, the crossbred calves, the male crossbred calves that are coming from the dairy herd, and their exportability, or their attractiveness for, they do only have a certain value. Our research within Teagasc over the last 10 years of that has shown that if you were to compare those Jersey cross male calves to the Holstein Friesian cross male calves, you know, they're worth probably in the region of €100 per head less when you compare them in terms of their profitability if you did hold on to them to finish. And that's a challenge then, because if the Friesian bull calf or the Holstein Friesian bull calf is only worth €40-50 in the market, and they're worth -100, you know, the sums don't add up on them. And the veal units on the continents have the same figures on that. And there's a large availability of Holstein Friesian bull calves, as you know, not all of our Friesian male calves are exported, so there's going to be a selection of those that are not going to be suitable. In terms again of Deputy Cahill's question, you know, our membership of farmers in KT, are they only interested in the schemes? That's not our experience. We'd find that within Teagasc we're operating 300 KT discussion groups. A little over 5,000 farmers are in those discussion groups. The previous scheme was the Beef Technology Adoption Programme, BTAP, that ran for 3 years as well. So the majority of those farmers at this stage have been in discussion groups for close to 6 years at this stage, or a little over 6 years. And we've seen significant progress within those KT groups in terms of the level of technology uptake by a significant proportion of those farms on that. So the level of uptake within groups, and we see it again in our Profit Monitor results, it is a select group of farmers. First of all, they are Teagasc clients, and then they are in KT groups. But that's probably where we're seeing more progress than you will see in national average figures from the National Farm Survey on that. And then just the final point that Senator Lombard, Frank again covered it in contract heifer rearing. Yeah, there is an attractiveness in contract heifer rearing. In terms of profitability, I suppose we're only starting to see farmers getting into these systems. Our initial figures, our initial analysis would be that where people do contract heifer rearing and they do it to a high level of efficiency, there's similar enough incomes done to where suckling or dairy calf to beef is done to a high level of efficiency. So you really, if you want to compare these systems, contract heifer rearing or dairy calf to beef or suckling, you really have to compare them at a high level of efficiency. And there's similar enough incomes at the high level of efficiency. And then just in relation to Deputy Murphy's, and Frank will probably come back in relation to, you know, is there a need for extra support for suckler beef farmers? We'd be constantly encouraging suckler beef farmers that when there are schemes such as the Beef Data Genomics Programme, which is worth quite a lot of money to suckler farmers, when that comes out, to encourage, you know, a big uptake of that. We would have seen that of the 65,000 suckler farmers in the country, less than half would have taken up that. So, and that's again, it's something that, you know, as an advisory service, we would have pushed strongly for both clients and non-clients to take it up. The government also launched a pilot beef efficiency improvement programme called BEEP short, and again we would have encouraged farmers, you know, it's worth €40 per cow. Farmers had to weigh the cow and weigh the calf to get that €40. It'll remain to see whether that full funding is actually taken up, but at this stage, it's only a percentage of beef farmers would have taken up that. So it's important that when schemes like that or support like that is available for suckler farmers, and efficiency is built into them, in that there's a certain amount of work that has to be done by the suckler farmer, but it's important that they take up that.
It's not oversubscribed, that particular beef scheme.
I haven't seen figures, Deputy, yet in terms of whether it's oversubscribed or not.
I stand to be corrected.
Okay, Professor O'Mara, do you want to?
Yeah, so look, it's I suppose a fundamental question you asked Deputy Murphy about, the sector and ongoing support, and look, that's a policy issue, so I'm not going to say yes or no, but just to give you my view, like the profitability, it's a factor of the efficiency on the farm, the price received, and then the direct payments, and the Senator Mulherin was asking earlier about the Chinese market and so on, and all the great work that's done by Borbia and others in getting access to that, and that's really important. But you have to remember as well that beef is competing with chicken and pork, which are much cheaper meats around the world. So there's only a certain amount that the market will be able to return. And while Ireland wants to we need to try to be kind of moving up the value chain and moving into premium markets, and that's trying to capitalise on this high quality product that we have. We need to continue to do that, but there's only a certain amount can be done in that. So the efficiency is where we operate, and we feel that there is a lot of scope on a lot of farms to improve efficiency. Okay, some of them for various demographics and other reasons will probably be slow to adopt the kind of technologies or the advice that we're saying, but there is a large cohort of farmers there that we feel have the potential to adopt some of the technologies to improve grassland management or improve the genetic merit of their suckler cows or whatever, and that's why those schemes that Peter mentioned we feel are very important, not just for the income support they give, but for the actual improvement that they can bring about on farms, the kind of long-term benefit that those schemes live. But there's no doubt, like, there is a profitability challenge on the sector, and when beef farmers with a good infrastructure on their land base and good land, and when they see the profitability in dairy, and for some of them that's going to be the option. And if beef farmers, if they don't improve their margin through productivity, or if the price doesn't increase, well, then those farmers are going to continue to face this income challenge unless there is a support payment or whatever. So, but that's obviously whether that happens is a decision not for us, but it is a sector with a big income issue to deal with.
Thanks, Professor O'Mara. Any other questions?
Deputy Cahill, the sex semen. So look, I don't have the figures off the top of my head. The fertility with the sex semen was lower. Like we've done 2 large trials now with sex semen. The first one was 3 or 4 years ago, and the fertility was about 20% lower. I can't remember exactly than conventional semen. The indications were that the process of producing the sex semen had improved over the years, and so we did another trial last year, hoping that we'd find improved fertility, and we found really it hadn't changed much from the previous trial at all. But there was some evidence when we kind of analysed the data in detail that the timing of AI might have an impact on the success rate with using sex semen. So we felt it was worth doing another trial looking at that, and that trial has been ongoing over the last number of weeks out on farms, where we're looking at the actual timing in relation to the onset of heat. So look, we're hopeful, but that we don't know what the answer will be. That's why we're doing the trial, that the fertility might be similar to what you get in conventional semen. And I don't know, Pierce, do you know the extra cost of a sex straw? Is it?
I don't know the exact figure, but it's probably around double the cost.
Yeah,
right.
Double, depending commercially. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We've spent a lot of time on this committee here in the last number of weeks dealing with this particular matter. It's a huge issue, a very important issue, obviously, for the farming sector. So this is our last hearings in the matter. We'll hope to have this report completed in the next couple of weeks. I think it's quite evident from the last number of meetings we've had there's no silver bullet in this sector, but we would hope to, I suppose, maybe help to ensure that there is a roadmap maybe for the future for the sector that would be helpful, that even though we all talk about crystal balls, that maybe the crystal ball might be a little bit clearer we'll have a report, and your contribution today will be invaluable in that regard. Thank you very much for your attendance here today. So could I just stand suspended for the next group before our committee? Thank you very much. Okay. Just before we begin, can I remind members and witnesses make sure the mobile phones are completely turned off, please, as normal. We're here today to discuss the Unfair Trading Practice Directive and the future of the beef sector in the context of Foodwise 2025. I'd like to welcome from the Competition and Consumer Protection Commission Ms Isabel Goggins, Chairperson, and Mr Fergal O'Leary, Member of the Commission, and thank him very much for coming before the committee to discuss the unfair trading practices. As you're aware, over the past number of weeks, we have been hearings in the future of the beef sector in the context of Foodwise 2025, and during those hearings, anti-competitiveness was raised on a regular number of occasions. This committee would like to address any concerns you may have on the allegations existing of anti-competitive practice in the beef sector, and any observations on the Glanbia KEPAC 2025 beef club that we mentioned. We would have informed you last week about this particular matter. As an initiative was raised by this committee, we would have dealt with that particular matter here a couple of weeks back, and we decided, as you know, to inform you in due to the fact that you're coming in of the issue and maybe your observations in that matter as regards the whole issue. And first of all, just to have to remind you about the issue of privilege. I want to bring to your attention, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of the evidence you give to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled to after only qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to effect, where possible, you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name in such ways to make him or her identifiable. Members are reminded of long-standing parliamentary practice to effect that members should not comment on and make charges against either a person outside the House or an official leader by name in such way as to make him or her identifiable. Ms Coughlin, I now ask you to make your opening statement, please.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you very much to the committee for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm joined today by Mr Fergal O'Leary, who's a member of the Commission, who has specific responsibility for the CCPC's Consumer Protection Division and for our advocacy and consumer information functions. We appeared before you last in October of last year, and since then we've closely followed the progress of the Unfair Trading Practices Directive through the European legislative process. We've also followed the committee's debates with great interest, and we are aware of the wide range of issues, particularly in relation to the beef sector, that have been raised by stakeholders. So my intention in addressing you today on both of these topics is to put forward some lessons from our own experience and some positive suggestions to assist the committee in its work. I will say that this directive is vastly different to the existing grocery regulations where we have a function. In terms of scope and size alone, we estimate that it could apply to about 10,000 businesses in Ireland. It's a very, very substantial directive. So we'd like to offer our considered views as to how it might be transposed in Ireland in such a manner as to address some of the issues raised by the stakeholders in this sector. Before going into those matters in detail, I just wanted to highlight one factor about the extensive nature of our current legislative mandate. We have a mandate right across the economy to promote consumer welfare. So that involves promoting compliance with over 40 competition and consumer protection legislative instruments. We're not specialised in any one sector. We go right across the full scope of the economy. We're aware that there have been concerns and questions around competition law and the 2020 Beef Club, and concerns about potential anti-competitive conduct in the behaviour in the beef sector more generally. These two areas are within our remit, and I think it's important to address those first. In terms of the 2020 Beef Club, we have received a small number of complaints in relation to this arrangement, and we are examining them carefully. However, I will say that this type of agreement, which is a vertical agreement, that's to say agreement between players at different stages in the food chain, generally are permissible under Irish and European competition laws. There's specifically what's known as the Verticals Block Exemption Regulation in European law, which exempts from competition law scrutiny vertical agreements where the market share of both the buyer and the seller is under 30%. So it's only if the market share goes above 30% you start to get concerns. Now, there might be sectors where, for instance, there were a lot of parallel agreements that kind of absorbed the whole market, where the benefit of the block exemption could potentially be withdrawn by the Commission. But in general, competition agencies are much more concerned about horizontal agreements. That's agreements between players at the same stage in the market. So we would never give a clean bill of health and say there's nothing to see here, and we will continue to make our inquiries, and we will continue to look at the complaints that we have received. But at this point, we don't have grounds to be concerned that a breach of competition law has occurred. We will continue to monitor its impact, and if at any future stage we have concerns, we will take action. Turning now to the allegations of the existence of a cartel in the beef processing sector. In Irish and European law, a cartel is an agreement between competitors to fix prices, to limit output or to share markets to their own benefit. It's a very, very serious breach of the law, so much so that it carries a criminal burden of proof similar to other crimes such as theft or murder. Anyone convicted of such a crime can face up to a maximum sentence of 10 years imprisonment. The serious nature of this crime frames how we investigate allegations of a cartel. The existence of an allegation does not provide us with sufficient basis to open an investigation or to obtain a warrant from a judge so that we can search the premises of suspected businesses. We have a team of experienced senior investigators, including both serving and former Gardaí, whose roles are to examine the evidence and establish lines of inquiry in relation to potential cartels. We also have a dedicated cartel immunity phone number for anyone who's been part of a cartel to come forward with evidence in return for immunity from prosecution. The CCPC's criminal investigation team has to date examined a number of complaints and followed various lines of inquiry in the meat processing sector. So far, however, we have not uncovered evidence of a cartel. And could I just say in relation to prices, there's a feeling sometimes that because there's a market price out there, because there's a common price among buyers and sellers, that that's evidence of a cartel. It's not. The prices being in line is not enough. In markets which are very transparent, and there are many such markets, prices do tend to converge at a market level. So, to take an example, if you go down Moore Street looking for apples, the price of apples is going to be pretty much the same at the top of the street as it is at the bottom. And the reason for that is that all the buyers and all the sellers can see each other's price. If any seller was to put their price up, they'd just lose market share because nobody will go and buy from them. If any seller is to put their price down, they know that all the other sellers will see that and they can put their price down, and so everybody loses money. So you just tend to get convergence where prices are very transparent, and that seems to be the case in the beef market. However, as I say, we haven't uncovered evidence of a cartel, but as with all sectors, we will continue to examine every complaint that we receive, and we welcome information or evidence of this nature from anyone. A member of our investigations team is available to meet anyone, in any location, at any time. We don't take these allegations lightly, but it's important to stress the need for tangible evidence. And when I say tangible evidence, I mean evidence of the collusion and evidence of the fact that people have got together to agree on prices when it comes to dealing with such a serious crime. We're also aware of broader concerns about sustainability and viability in farming that are currently being widely discussed and debated in the sector, and we listened with great interest to the end of your discussion with the people from Teagasc. The concerns would obviously include farm income levels, farmers' lack of power and their limited ability to negotiate the price they get from their products, a lack of transparency in terms of who's profiting in the food chain. And these don't fall within our remit, but they're all interrelated issues. And we'd like to offer, I suppose, our considered views as to how some of these could be addressed in the transposition of the directive. In considering the issues before the committee regarding the agriculture sector generally and the directive in particular, it's important to consider the context. The characteristics of the agriculture sector, of which you all know a great deal more than I do, but including things like vulnerability to extreme weather, imbalances between supply and demand, price income fluctuations, they all mean that market instability is a common feature and a concern for all farmers. The committee and the majority of those that appeared before it have pointed to low relative bargaining power as one of the major issues in this sector, and this has often been cited as a competition problem. We understand the desire to address an imbalance of power against farmers, but in our view the way to redress this imbalance is not through competition law. Attempts have been made to use exemptions from competition law to rebalance bargaining power in the sector, such as allowing the vertical agreements and the development of producer organisations. However, the issues remain prevalent in the sector. The directive has also been put forward as a solution to the issue, but if the aim is to address the farmers' imbalance in market power, then it's our considered view that, as it stands, it's unlikely to succeed, and I think many of the people that you've spoken to have also expressed that view. So I'd like to turn to some suggestions for what might help. Power imbalances are best addressed before contracts are signed, rather than trying to address them after the fact. To be successful, a dedicated body is required to provide real support for the sector. A critical component of this will be through advice to individual farmers. They need to know what is allowed, what isn't allowed, who they can go to when they have a problem. Members will be aware that the directive requires the appointment of a competent authority or authorities. Across Europe, there have been a wide range of views expressed as to how this will be implemented and whether there should be a standalone body or whether various organisations should be given specific mandates, and the appointment of more than one competent body is allowed for in the directive. So, for instance, one might provide support and another might receive complaints. We're unaware if such an arrangement has been considered here. In a number of sectors like telecoms, financial services, energy, a sector-specific body is given a remit to ensure that the specific rules of that sector are adhered to. They have access to industry information, to contacts. They build up expertise in this sector. So they can see market trends or issues as they develop, and they can take preventative steps or alter the rules so that they reflect new market dynamics as they develop. And because their legislation is industry-specific, they can be both proactive and responsive. They're entirely focused on that sector and its needs. A body dedicated to this sector would develop the information structures and relationships to provide a real support for the sector. If such a sectoral regulator or office were developed, part of its functions could include devising and implementing a strategy to support farmers in the context of CAP reform, advising on commercial and economic development for the sector, and overseeing the implementation of future European legislation. For instance, we're aware that last week details of the EU's proposal for more market transparency in the EU's food supply chain were announced, which, if that was progressed, that's going to need a body to capture the price data and the market data and correlate it all. As I say, the nature of this industry is that, things are moving quickly. Issues need to be addressed as they arise. Farmers can't wait for lengthy investigations and the uncertainty of legal challenges. The CCPC's investigations are and will continue to be evidence-based and mostly retrospective. This means that they take time. We don't act or secure outcomes for individual businesses or consumers. We're not an ombudsman. We're there to enforce the law. Under the current grocery regulations, we have not to date received sufficient information from suppliers to establish that a breach of the regulations has occurred or is occurring. We believe that farmers in particular want somebody who's on the ground, who's focused on the farming sector exclusively and who can act quickly on their behalf, including offering some form of adjudication rather than an enforcement approach that takes place after a breach of the directive has occurred. So to do this effectively, alternative approaches such as mediation or arbitration, as in the EU Code, should be considered. The role of competent authority for this directive, we believe, requires a dedicated organisation on the ground with specialist expertise, knowledge and with the ability to build confidence across the sector. In return, we believe the complaints about breaches and other issues would be more likely to be forthcoming. Now, we're in existence in various forms for a long time. We're not naive about the significance of this and the cost that there would be in establishing a dedicated sectoral regulator, and we haven't come to this conclusion lightly. But considering the nature of this market, the issues that there are around sustainability, around viability, and our experience in engaging with this sector, if the object is really to rebalance power, a more substantial and more interventionist approach is required. I'd like to use the last few minutes of my time to highlight some points that we think need to be considered in relation to the transposition of the directive in Ireland, including the decision on the most appropriate competent authority or authorities. As I said earlier, the scale and scope of the directive is vastly different to the existing grocery regulations. And I mentioned that we would estimate that in Ireland the legislation could apply to an estimated 10,000 traders in the food supply chain and the direct relationships that they have with suppliers. That's compared to the 22 grocery undertakings and the direct relationships they have with suppliers, which are within the scope of the current grocery regulations. So there's orders of magnitude in the difference there. This expanded scope will have significant cost implications, and consideration needs to be given to how a regulatory regime would be funded. Our initial, very ballpark estimate is that to successfully achieve the aims of the directive, 40 staff at a minimum would be required. The skill sets required would include investigators, economists, legal advisors, supply chain experts and auditors. And to give a kind of tangible benchmark on costs, in the UK, the work of the Grocery Code adjudicator, dealing with a much smaller number, costs £2 million a year, although we understand that they don't necessarily use all of that in a single year. And it's funded by a levy on the retailers, the 10 retailers that are within its scope. A further complication is that the directive applies to commercial relationships regardless of the place of establishment of the supplier or buyer. And talking about Brexit here, this has particularly significant implications for Ireland more than any other member state because of the interconnected nature of the Ireland and UK agri-food sectors. So the mechanism to promote compliance with the directive needs to be considered very carefully. The legal basis for the directive lies in Article 43(2) of the Treaties on the Functioning of the European Union. They relate to the CAP and its objectives, including to safeguard farmers making a reasonable living. We recognise and acknowledge the importance of such objectives. However, unfortunately, they can and they will conflict on occasion with consumers' interests and welfare. It should also be said that the original proposal was significantly expanded in the final directive, extending it to all actors in the food chain. We note that large processors and manufacturers are requesting that the regime be further expanded upwards to address their issues with buyer power. In contrast, others believe that the directive doesn't go far enough and have stated that a ban on below-cost selling is required. That is a measure which we, the CCPC, would strongly oppose. In our view, banning below-cost selling doesn't guarantee better prices for food producers. It instead guarantees higher profits for retailers and higher prices for consumers. Our role is focused on the welfare of consumers. We believe that this is an important job. We're aware that there's a body of work ahead in the transposition of this legislation, and while fully respecting that our role can be and is changed by the Oireachtas, we believe in the work that we're doing, and again I say right across the entire economy, across every sector, and we wish to be allowed to continue it. If we were to be given the role of competent authority for this directive, there's little doubt that it would drain resources and focus from across the organisation, and our ability to work on consumers' behalf would be seriously compromised. So for all of those reasons, we strongly ask you to consider our view that a dedicated sectoral body is required. In our view, it should be empowered to not only enforce the directive, but also to deliver ongoing regulatory interventions to improve the welfare of Irish farmers. Given the transposition deadline, and I know the work of the committee is coming to a close, a decision on this would need to be made as a matter of urgency. The alternative is simply unlikely to achieve the desired change in the sector. We will, of course, continue to do our part in this sector and all others. This includes continuing our work to ensure compliance with the existing grocery regulations. We'd also be very happy to work with anybody who is designated with a role in the sector. We've previously worked closely with other bodies in the setting up of new regulatory systems, and we're ready to provide assistance in any way that we can. So thank you, Chairman, and we're happy to take any questions and expand on our views further.
Thank you very much for your very informative presentation, Ms Coughlin. There's now members. Deputy Cahill is first to indicate.
First of all, thanks for the presentation, and again, I have to say it was very informative and very detailed. And I suppose, you know, we're here to discuss the beef industry and the profitability of the beef industry going forward. The primary producer out there feel that, you know, there's loads of regulation out there, but none of the regulation in place to protect him or to look after his interest. And I know you talk about the 2020 club and the 2020 beef club. And if my understanding is correct, what you're saying is that it's not large enough to warrant that it is anti-competitive. You know, does the size of it really matter? If it is an anti-competitive practice, is it not anti-competitive irrespective of the percentage of the market that it has? That's the first question I would ask. Now, onto the beef cartel, and I suppose, you know, this is something that has been bet to death for a long number of years. And there's, if you would ask 100 farmers out there, do they believe a cartel exists? 99 of them will say yes. And the fact, you know, you say that a common price isn't evidence enough for a cartel. But, you know, these are all operators who are selling into different markets and getting different returns. And, you know, it's definitely more than a coincidence that on a Friday evening or Monday morning, you'll get the same price quoted across the board for all the factories. And I just, you know, the primary producer out there is convinced that a cartel exists. The price, like, there was a time where you'd ring different factories to try and get different quotations, and there would be a different quotation among different factories. That has evaporated over the years. There's no point in going to a different processor because there won't be any differential in price. So, you know, I accept what you're saying, that a common price doesn't signify guilt of a cartel. But for the private producer out there, they know that all these processors have different markets and different returns, And to explain to the farmer producing his beef animal that a cartel doesn't exist is difficult in the extreme. And, you know, we've seen, I suppose the primary producer has seen the competition authority in the past investigating different things that farming organisations were doing. And they find it extremely hard to understand why a similar investigation isn't done into how factories determine their price on a Friday evening or a Monday morning. So I'm very thankful for the explanations you go into later on and the explanations of your mandate and the powers and the various things. That is very good information for us. And, you know, I intend to, you know, the Fianna Fáil people, we will take it away and discuss it, and I think it's extremely helpful, and we're very glad at the presentation. But from the primary producer, they're the two issues I would like to see debated.
Cahill. Senator Mulherin.
Have you received any complaints directly in relation to price fixing with meat processors, and have you received complaints from any of the farmer organisations or individual farmers? Have you ever investigated any such claims, or indeed, as has been also suggested, like at what point are you going to take initiative in terms of an investigation? Because I would agree, every farmer believes that there's price fixing going on with most of the meat processors, and you roll up at your meat processor on a Monday morning and everybody has the same price. And it's not like Moore Street where everybody's in viewing distance. They're not. So, you know, that there's information shared, and even if it's done in a loose fashion, the farmers are the losers.
Senator Daly.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And I welcome the presentation. It's a very comprehensive and detailed presentation, and it's one that I'd be taking away and studying in further detail. In fact, there's so much information in there, there's very few questions left need to be asked, actually, until I have it analysed. But I suppose one I would like to get some more comment on, and again, it's coming at the issue that has been raised with regard to the perceived or the reported cartel within the beef industry, and price fixing or communication within the sector before prices are advertised or announced. There's also a trend of thought out there that the prices don't need to be fixed that much, in the sense that there would be a lot of them coming, while maybe from different named processors would be coming out from under the one umbrella. And that is another role you play when it comes to mergers, acquisitions and takeovers. And when we're talking about the beef sector, so when in that particular sector, for example, would you call stop? It hasn't happened yet to an evident takeover of an industry by an individual company, you know, gaining more and more power. And when you own the job lot, you don't need communication with your competitors. You don't have that many competitors, and therein you name the price. You don't have to fix it at all. You set it, you name it, and people have to take it because of your power. So there have been a number of takeovers and indeed mergers in recent years, all of which you would have been consulted about at the time, none of which you actually stopped or even had flagged issues with, I think, from memory. I'm open to correction on that. So how big would one ownership within a certain sector need to be before you would flag it as being a possible breach, or where would you shout stop, or when would you shout stop? And do you not think that maybe you could have or should have shouted stop already in some instances within the beef sector? Thank you.
Senator. Deputy Murphy, you have a question?
Yeah, very, very brief. I mean, it's really, I suppose, a repetition of what the previous three speakers have said. Look, I actually was reading this before you started into it, and like others, I have to say it's a really, you know, productive document in terms of what you're offering and what you're suggesting, and I appreciate that you go to great lengths to explain, you know, the seriousness of cartels if they do exist, and within the law, if that's found to be in practice out there. Now, you do say, in terms of the 2020 Beef Club, the CCPC has received a small number of complaints. Is it possible to say how many complaints you've got at this stage? And again, the problem I have going to farm meetings, the beef plant meetings, the IFA meetings, and farmers coming to you individually, they are convinced out there that this cartel exists. And I think Deputy Cahill referred to the Friday evening and the Monday morning price, or Senator Daly, whichever. And you know, when you check it and look at it, it does, for people like us, look that there's some fixing going on there. And no question about it, as other speakers have said, the farming community are utterly convinced of this price fixing. And this is where we're fixed. We can't, obviously you think it's not serious enough to be investigated. We would have to say here, as speaking, I suppose, on behalf of people we meet in our constituency offices and in our counties, when they show you prices and show you comparisons, you just have to get this feeling that there's something going on there. So basically, how many complaints have you got? And, you know, what can we do for those people, even though you go into a lot of explanation in the document, what can we do for those people who feel that they're being, you know, blackguarded by these factories?
Thanks, Deputy Murphy.
Thanks,
Just before I come back to you, Ms. Corcoran, I think there's no doubt your presentation, as I said a few minutes ago, is very, very helpful. And I think in your last paragraph, actually, you were very helpful from our point of view. You straight away give us one recommendation for our report, in my opinion. When you're recommending that a dedicated sectoral body is required. I think there's no doubt that I'll probably speak for everybody in our committee that I think everybody would be in broad agreement in that regard. I think it's possibly one way forward of maybe addressing some of the issues that Deputy Murphy and others have highlighted. Could you maybe put a bit more feedback maybe into a dedicated sectoral body? What would you see that, and how would you see it structured maybe going forward?
Thanks very much, Chairman. I'm going to start by addressing Deputy Cahill's question about what's large enough and does size matter, and I might ask Mr. O'Leary to deal with the questions about the cartel. But yeah, this is a genius question, right? Because this goes to the core of competition law and the difference that I spoke about between the vertical and horizontal agreements. Size doesn't matter in a cartel. All cartels are illegal. Any kind of a cartel, it's a criminal offence. Doesn't matter whether it's big or small. Vertical agreements, they're what's called, there you look at the effect of the agreement. So when you look at competition law, it always says agreements are illegal which have the object or effect of preventing, restricting or distorting competition. So object or effect. Cartels are object restrictions, as we call them, so they're always illegal, and it doesn't matter how small it was, and it doesn't matter if you say you didn't mean to do it or whatever. They're always illegal. Agreements which have an anti-competitive effect, vertical agreements generally considered not to have an anti-competitive effect until you go above a certain market share threshold. So, and generally they are efficiency enhancing. They make it more efficient for the producer, for the supplier. There's more certainty because it's a contract, and that's a big issue as well, because it tries to kind of iron out some of the volatility. But that's where you say the European Commission, in their verticals block exemption regulation, they have what's called a safe harbour. So if the market share of the upstream and the downstream, the producer and the supplier, if they're both below 30%, then it's okay. So in that case, size does matter, and smaller agreements which cover a lesser part of the market are just generally not considered to be a problem, unless, say, you had 3 or 4 agreements that sewed up the entire market and nobody could come in at either level. But yeah, that's what a lot of people spend their time doing, actually, is looking at the effects of those kind of vertical agreements. But just looking at the stats that were in the 2020 Beef Club, I mean, they were looking at, getting up to something like 5%. If all the predictions came true and all the market share forecasts, they might get up to 5% in a few years' time. And that's really just not at a level that would kind of trigger our concerns.
Yeah, and just if I might add as well on the Beef Club, we know that other suppliers are thinking about similar initiatives, and from our point of view, as is all said in the statement, at the moment it isn't a concern, but the bigger it gets, the more attention it would get from us. So we're not saying that always into the future everything is fine, and we will continue to monitor that. What I would say as well, I think is important, is that I would have thought that any company the size of Glanbia would have taken legal advice itself before implementing such a scheme, because our reputation does precede us, and if it was seen that it was even close to the margins, I would expect that they would expect to hear from us. In terms of the cartel, I have read an awful lot about testimony in front of this committee, newspaper reports, indeed spoken to farmers myself, and I agree with the sentiment made that farmers feel very hard done by. I agree with you as well in terms of if you did ask 99, they would say that there is price fixing going on. What I can say from the CCPC point of view is that we have had complaints. Senator Mulherin asked. We had 1 in 2016, 4 in 2017 and 1 in 2018. That 1 in 2018 was anonymous. But what I can guarantee this committee is that we looked into each and every one of those thoroughly. Cartel investigations are the lifeblood of our organisation. We had a successful case earlier on in the year before the courts, and what that does for us in terms of motivating staff, in terms of our reputation, we want to have these cases successfully brought about. As Deputy Cahill said, we have looked at issues in the agri sector before, so there is no sector that we won't look at. But from a value for money point of view to the taxpayer, we have to have some evidence to go after it. So I would ask in this committee, and for the contacts that the senators and the deputies have, if anybody has information, as I said in the statement, we will meet them at any location at any time, and we will look into that, any kind of evidence we receive. Just as I did say, the one in 2018, that was an anonymous complaint. We still looked into it. We spent a lot of time on it. We want to do that. But as Isolde has highlighted, this is a market with a lot of price information out there. It's published in the newspapers, it's published in agriculture, it's published at a certain time. Isolde made the analogy of Moore Street. We have a cost comparison website where you will find every mortgage rate in the country. So the information is out there. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's a cartel.
Is transparency a bigger issue maybe in the whole, as part of the problem? There would be a perception, rightly or wrongly, that it's not transparent enough compared to maybe, say, the dairy industry.
I think transparency is an issue, and I suppose transparency works both ways. If there's perfect transparency, then as we're saying, there is a convergence in price. But I think the difficulty here is that there isn't transparency in terms of margins. And I think that's where a lot of the interest is. Again, from our point of view, coming back to the UTP directive, it's buyer power of a lot of small farmers that the directive has been put forward as a way to address that. But we don't think, as the directive is currently detailed, that rebalance is going to happen. And so that's where we come to additional measures, more scrutiny, and the idea of the sectoral regulator.
Okay. So, Deputy Cahill, yep. Sorry, Deputy Cahill.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the B20 club there for a minute. I suppose it's on the input side that the major concerns are being raised by individuals with us. It's unusual. Glanbia, as you correctly said, is a very large company with a very large reputation, and still they feel it's necessary to force the participants in the scheme to buy all their inputs from them. And you have a lot of other co-op merchants and private merchants, most of them of far smaller scale, who, in the view of those merchants now, have presented to us that they're being put at a very competitive disadvantage. And, while it's probably outside your remit, Glanbia have a mechanism with the Glanbia Co-op of giving bonuses at in to redistribute their profits. Now, that's probably beyond the remit. But private merchants are making the case to us. They're small. They're in the business. They're finding it hard to compete with this big corporate beside them, who has various mechanisms of trying to disguise the price they're paying. And here now being forcing the customers into a scheme and tying them into a scheme for a period of time. If you go into it and you've gone into it for 6 months, you're forgoing all the advantages going forward by going out of it. So it's not the end price that's the be all of this scheme. It's the fact that the inputs is being completely being controlled by a large player.
Any further comment, Mr. O'Leary, on that?
Yeah, just I suppose this is the reason that really comes. This is the issue that comes to the nub of the vertical exemption. In that, the idea is that for some the benefits will outweigh the cost to competition, or the restriction of competition by allowing people to be locked in, and that's where the size of it is very, very important. So some people, and we've seen the commentary on this, some people think it's evidence of new thinking in the sector that's very welcome, that might be useful for some farmers, whereas the opposite in terms of this restriction has already been cited as a problem. So from our point of view, as long as it stays relatively small and doesn't go over a certain amount, there isn't a concern at the moment. But
so you can sin a little, but not sin a lot.
Through the chair.
Very nicely phrased, yeah.
Through the chair, you're using the argument of the end output of maximum, if to meet all their targets, 5% of the beef industry. The point Deputy Cahill has made, how far back down the actual trading curves or trends do you go to look at? Like, to buy into that scheme, in producing that 5% of the beef, if all targets are made, you have to buy all your inputs and unrelated inputs, all your on-farm products you will be buying from a cooperative or a similar type supplier. You have to buy them all from Glanbia. So while it might be only an end product of 5% of the beef, if you have other activities on your farm, and you include your fertiliser, not just your inputs into the production of the beef, which is part of the package, you have to buy everything. It's going to be far greater than 5% of the trading turnover, agricultural trading turnover, within the sector who will be buying into this scheme that we're talking about in the competition between different mills or different co-ops. Like the overall percentage or final percentage of the actual beef production is only 5%. But to get to there by virtue of the fact that you have to tie into all your inputs on your farm if you're in the scheme, it's going to be far greater than 5% of the trading value of farm to co-op or farm to supplier.
I mean, part of the analysis, certainly, we wouldn't just look at the output, the end point. We do, and we would look at the inputs as well. So, absolutely, that's important. But again, from what we've seen, and this is where we're slightly restricted in terms of what we can say around it not being fine forever. But from what we've seen so far, looking at both the output and some of the inputs, we still don't see that they're going over the thresholds to date.
Ms. Goggins?
Sorry. Thanks, Chairman. I just wanted to go back on your point about a sectoral regulator and what they might do. And this, like, to an extent, this is going back to a previous job that I had when I was the telecoms regulator before being in the Competition and Consumer Protection Commission. So I would put it down to 4 main strands: information gathering, advice, mediation and arbitration, and enforcement. Information gathering, I think, is really important, because it would be really important for people to know what's going on in the industry, and exactly this point about what, digging down into the levels, what happens at the levels that aren't transparent, the levels where we don't see all the prices being quoted. And I put that as a function of the regulator, because you have to have statutory powers to look for that information. Like we used to, when I was in Comreg, we used to publish a quarterly bulletin of the kind of main statistics in the industry, and that was provided to us by the industry, but you had to make sure that everybody provided it to you in a format that you could use and that was actually comparable. So you weren't getting, one format from one crowd and one from something else. You had to be able to kind of add it together and make a coherent whole. I'd say advice to farmers, and Fergal made the point that it's really important that farmers should get that advice before they sign the contract. That it's the danger with all these things, and we would see it to an extent in the existing grocery regulations, is the imbalance is such that if you've got a big supplier, a big retailer and a small supplier, the retailer is the one with all the lawyers and the corporate staff and everything, and they'll go in and say, put a 300-page contract down and say, here's where you sign. That's not a negotiation. In any meaning of the word. So, you have to have people knowing what their rights are in terms of the directives. And also, I would say, from our point of view, the kind of producer organisations that are permitted by exemption from competition law under the latest round of the CMO regulation, that kind of thing should help farmers to build scale and to be able to work together, then I'd say mediation and arbitration, because there's going to be rows and there's going to be things that need to be sorted. And that's where you need, you know, I made the point earlier that we're not an ombudsman. We don't do that. We take cases to court, but we're taking the cases to court on behalf of the state, not on behalf of an individual. You know, we're saying, like, the law was broken here, so on behalf of the state, we're intervening. But it's not to get something back for particular consumers. There is, in some areas of consumer law, there's a right for a kind of a, what do you call the thing? Sorry, compensation order, sorry. But not in the competition law sphere. And then I would say enforcement as a backstop, because I think at the end of it you have to have a big stick, you know. So that's what I would recommend anyway for the functions of a regulator.
I mean, you see that as a costly operation, in your opinion?
It's as long as a piece of string, isn't it?
I mean, it's first of all, just if we look at the situation across...
Somebody has to pay at the end of the day.
Absolutely, and they do. And if you look at the situation across the way, you have a lot of this. You have the information and you have the adjudication, you have the investigations, and that, as we said in the statement, costs 2 million sterling per year. However, the scope is smaller. So something like this, as we say, would probably be about 40 people. And what you would need, though, is a period of implementation and then escalation. So when we get new functions, as we do, what we do first is we build a common level of understanding across a particular sector so that everybody understands what the rules are. We spend probably a year or two doing that. And at that point, after that, everybody knows what the rules are, and then you start into the enforcement side of it. So that kind of regulatory model is something that is done over a period of time. The difficulty, though, with this directive is it's hugely complex in terms of what it allows. There's a list of 10 things that are blacklisted, things like payment after 30 days or payment after 60 days. Then you get into a list of, I think it's 6 what they call grey listed areas. So they're only allowed if they've been agreed in advance. And again, each individual entity that will be under the onus of these regulations will have to understand what is and isn't allowed. And we really feel that that is a very significant educational challenge, and it will take a couple of years to do that. And then if you're looking at things like mediation, who do I go to? What kind of information do I need to have before I go to them? And then afterwards, you go to the idea of enforcement. I mean, just from our point of view, in looking at this, and what we don't believe that there's been an impact analysis done for Ireland yet. So, you know, this is all still open to scrutiny. But you really need people in regional locations across the country advising people what's allowed, what isn't allowed, and when you do have a problem, a well-founded problem, who do you go to and what can they offer you in terms of mediation or redress?
Okay. Any other questions, members? Okay.
My question wasn't addressed about the mergers, acquisitions, and
apologies. Yeah.
Apologies, Deputy. Yeah. So on mergers, they're really looked at on a case-by-case basis. Some of them come to us. So the bigger ones will go to the European Commission. You know, so Slaney, Dawn Meats would have gone to the EU because it's over certain thresholds. But what you're really looking at is, well, the test is whether there is or isn't a substantial lessening of competition. And that really involves looking at a lot of factors about it, the strength of buyers, the strength of sellers, how much competition there is there, how much competition might come in. I mean, I'm reluctant to give you how many is enough or you know, how many players is enough, because the European Commission, and we do a lot of very detailed scrutiny on every merger that comes in. So there have been industries where a 4-to-3 merger has been permitted. So where there used to be 4 players and say the number 1 player buys the number 4 player, that will be looked at differently from the number 1 player buying the number 2 player, for instance, because then you'd be saying that the 2 strongest players are coming together. Sometimes a market with 3 strong players is more competitive than a market with 4 not so strong competitors. So when would you call stop? I can't give you an actual figure of the number of competitors or the market share, because it does depend on how easy it is to enter and to exit the market. But I mean, I'm sure you'll know, Senator, that you know there's a great deal of scrutiny goes into this, and the decisions that are published, you know, like that one that I mentioned, you know, they're very, very complicated. assessments of the market, and we had one in Kerry Brio a while back where we blocked the merger, we actually lost. But again, that was based on a very, very detailed dig into all the different sectors and all the different kind of products that were involved. So I'm sorry that there isn't a yes-no answer, but it just does take a lot of scrutiny, and it depends on the type of market that it is.
Thank you very much, Ms Goggins and Mr O'Leary, for your very informative presentation here today. I think it's something that we're going to hear plenty more of as we move forward. I think this will be very useful from our point of view when we're compiling our report in the next couple of weeks. So I think that completes our business for today. There's no further business. Meetings adjourned until Tuesday, the 11th of June at 3:30 p.m. Thank you very much, everybody.